Indeed. Okay, so a quick note that we are recording and that this recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. Our first session is interpretations of mass violence, and our first speaker will be Philip Dwyer, Professor of History and the founding director of the Centre for the Study of Violence at the University of Newcastle here in Australia. He has published widely on the revolutionary and Napoleonic eras and is general editor of the Cambridge World History of Violence and co-editor of the Cambridge History of the Napoleonic Wars. He is currently writing a global history of violence from prehistory to the present, and his paper today is titled Mass Violence, Genocide, and Killing in War, Some Recent Debates. Over to you, Philip.
Thanks, Sasha, and thanks for organising this. Thanks to you and Emmett for organising this. Widely published. I like that turn of phrase. Not a specialist of the Ottoman lands, needless to say, but what I'd like to do is offer a sort of conceptual mise à jour, if you like, a framework within which discussions about mass violence and genocide might take place, and to ask what conceptual methodological crossovers there might be, if any, between those who study the Holocaust, for example, and those who study genocide more broadly, including the Armenian Genocide. Now, the literature on mass violence and genocide, as you can imagine, is enormous. I mean, there's really quite a substantial and a significant body of work that's out there now. So let me underline a few basics that social scientists and historians might agree on. To state one of the more obvious observations, there is often a close relationship between mass killing and warfare. Mass killing and atrocities are used by military and political leaders to accomplish specific goals, which will vary slightly according to the war and the period in question that we're dealing with. Civilians are targeted when a military conflict cannot be won through conventional means, or when the military need to remove a perceived threat. This is often the case when we're dealing with counterinsurgency operations, for example. And as a rule of thumb, this simple framework is applicable to all military conflicts from ancient times to the present, including the war in Ukraine, and any number of books and articles on massacres, mass killings, and atrocities have examined the processes and dynamics involved. And as I've already said, the literature is now on mass violence and genocide is vast. For about 6 decades now, scholars have grappled with the vexed problem of why individuals kill civilians in war, and more specifically, why they commit atrocities and take part in massacres and mass killings, some of which can lead to genocide. Mass killings don't always lead to genocide, I would argue. Much of the literature came out on mass killings, and genocide has come out of the Holocaust, out of Holocaust studies in the 1960s and 1970s, where there was an attempt to understand and to psychologize the motives of the perpetrators. And this has since morphed into a burgeoning subfield, more recently called perpetrator studies, Täterforschung in German. Historians are particularly interested in why, as Christopher Browning phrased it, ordinary men are able to kill with seeming ease, and not just kill, but to take part in mass killings and to commit atrocities. And by atrocity, I mean the torture, mutilation of the body, both before and after killing, and rape. And since Christopher Browning's seminal study appeared in the 1990s, so it's 30 years old now, there have been a plethora of studies on the leading architects of different genocides, and some studies on frontline perpetrators, as well as mid and lower level military and police functionaries. And we've got two examples of this approach with us today, with Hansukas Kiese's work on Talat Pasha and Ümit Kurt's forthcoming book on the lives of three Turkish genocidaires. Over the past few decades, this debate has swung from one extreme to the other. So from Christopher Browning's study of the police battalion in Poland during the Second World War, in which he concluded that ideology was not as important as group loyalty and obedience, to a recent work by a political scientist from Oxford called Jonathan Leader Maynard, who concludes that ideology, in the broadest possible sense of that word, is of primary importance. Now, admittedly, Browning himself has since modified his views, and he now believes that not all of the police were without ideology. And, his views were challenged by Daniel Goldhagen. I won't go into that debate. It's not necessary here. Goldhagen's views, I think, are deeply flawed. Browning, as I said, downplayed ideology, as well as downplaying fear of punishment at not obeying the order to kill. But he's not alone in thinking this. A recent work by two German scholars, one a military historian and the other a social psychologist, Sönke Neitzel and Harald Welzer, examined the transcripts of secret recordings made of conversations between German prisoners of war in England. The view that ordinary soldiers became involved in extraordinary crimes not due to fear of punishment or ideological indoctrination, but rather due to a higher duty of proving one's masculinity as a man among men, a bond strengthened by the shared experiences of danger and deprivation on the Eastern Front. Most of the men simply, it seems, and this is the conclusion of these two authors, transferred civilian labor terms onto a wartime setting so that they had targets to hit and results to achieve. And this was an efficient way for them to rationalize the violence and instrumentalize human casualties. So in the debates, the larger debates about whether there was a period of brutalization needed for men to be able to kill, it seems that, at least according to Neitzel and Welzer, most of the soldiers needed no period of brutalization. They simply transferred their work ethic to their new tasks, which was mass killing. And we see something similar happening in the Pacific theater of operations during the Second World War, when American troops who had never seen action before immediately began carrying out atrocities against the Japanese. In the Ottoman case, and here I don't know enough about who the perpetrators were and the extent to which the military or civilian populations were involved in mass killings and genocide, but I would think, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, the Balkan Wars were likely to have played a key role or key formative period for many of these perpetrators. But this really, I'm getting off track here. This is a debate about brutalization. And it's clear that in many cases, a period of adjustment or acclimatization to mass killing is not needed. A more interesting question then is why this is the case. And this brings us back to strategy versus ideology debate that's been going on for some years now. In the strategy camp, we have mass killings that are generally initiated by political or military elites, implemented by rank and file subordinates, and sometimes, but not always, tacitly or actively supported by broader segments of the society from which the perpetrators originate. I think we can see something similar taking place in Russia, in Ukraine at the moment. It appears that most scholars probably come down the side of mass killing as a strategic form of violence. But to accept this is to argue that mass killings are not irrational or illogical. They are deliberate, ruthlessly efficient ways for perpetrators to achieve their goals, even if they might appear to be wanton and senseless from the outside. As the genocide scholar Benjamin Valentino puts it, and he was paraphrasing Clausewitz's famous dictum, sometimes mass killing is simply war by other means. So leaders may choose to target enemy civilians in the hope of coercing surrender without having to defeat the enemy's military forces directly. The other approach to understanding mass killing is to focus on the importance of ideology. Mass killings generally take place within a belief system that allows elites to justify the killings on the grounds that the targeted group represent a threat to, and here you can just fill in the blank space, pretty much put in whatever you like. You can see that there is some crossover here with the strategy approach. It doesn't matter how fanciful the rhetoric or the narrative is. You know, the Nazis believed that there was a Jewish will conspiracy. The Russians have been touting the Ukrainians as neo-Nazis. The Young Turks believed that Armenians wanted to break away from the empire and form their own state in Anatolia. It doesn't matter whether these things are true or not. If it's believed by a large enough group of people, it can be used to justify the violence. And in that event, the violence is bound to be perceived differently by different people. Again, I don't know if the Armenians were intent on creating their own state in Anatolia, but as I said, that's beside the point. The fact that the Young Turk elite believed it to be true was justification enough for what they considered to be a preemptive strike against the Armenians. There has to be then some kind of justificatory narrative that frames the killing. The soldier on the ground doesn't have to be committed to these narratives, but they are generally pervasive enough, either in the population at large or broadcast in the media, to be more or less believed, while the alternative narratives are almost impossible to get through. They're drowned out. In recent works, much more emphasis has been placed on mass killings as what leader Maynard has called radicalized security politics, or what Dirk Moses has called the notion of, he's come up with the concept of permanent security, by which mass killings and population deportations are done with the goal of achieving some kind of future strategic security. So in this way, military operations that kill civilians are usually justified by arguments about their promised long-term benefits. So for leader Maynard, for example, the Nazis justified mass killings for the future security of the German people. The practice of killing perceived future threats, including women and children, was also stressed by Talat Pasha when he told a German journalist, I think it was in 1916, I'm not quite sure about the date, when he said, quote, "We have been reproached for making no distinction between the innocent Armenians and the guilty, but that was utterly impossible in view of the fact that those who are innocent but that was utterly impossible in view of the fact that those who are innocent today might be guilty tomorrow." So the common motivation for deporting or destroying groups of people is that they are rebellious or that they are cooperating with the enemy in a time of war. And the enemy is destroyed in order to reach permanent security so that the perceived threat will never happen again. We can see here that research on the whole has not moved away from the motives of individuals towards context and structure, with a greater emphasis placed on ideology. This doesn't mean to say that the psychology or the agency of the individual is no longer counts for anything. It still does, since individuals can interpret orders differently, or they can find ways of avoiding carrying them out. There's another sociologist by the name of Sinisa Milicevic, who's written a book recently called Why Humans Fight. And in it, he argues that social organizations, and whether we're talking about the army or police units or even criminal gangs, create their own internal logic that manages to pull in hesitant and even unwilling individuals. So there are a couple of arguments going on here about ideology as broad belief, and then these organizations coercing individuals to do their dirty work for them. So a lot of historians, I think, have in the past overlooked how people are coerced into fighting and killing, and they've overlooked up to a point, I think, the coercive powers of the state, which are, of course, extremely broad. But people do and have resisted those powers, especially in times of war. You can look, for example, at the mutinies during the First World War in the French and German and Russian armies, which led to the collapse of some states and empires. They're a reminder that if states manage war poorly, and if they manage their people and their armies poorly, then that state can fail. So in reflecting on why individuals are prepared to fight and kill, Milicevic in Why Humans Fight proposes an alternative model that he calls networks of micro-solidarity. Put simply, people fight because of the strong bonds soldiers develop among each other, and they kill and even take part in ethnic cleansing and genocide and acts of terrorism because they somehow believe they are protecting their families and friends or their comrades in arms. The sentiments expressed by soldiers from really, you can find this across cultures, is that, and they all seem to have remarkably similar feelings and motives, is that they are fighting for and protecting significant others. That's usually uppermost in their minds, at least as a justification after the fact for killing. It might not explain entirely why people fight and kill, but it does give us some insight into why they become involved in mass killing events. Okay, I'll try and conclude with a few brief generalizations. First of all, I think long-standing ethnic hatreds or long-standing racist plans to purify societies are not really the primary reason why mass killings occur. This might seem somewhat counterintuitive, and it's possible that individual perpetrators are motivated by racial hatred, but it's often a strategy by military and political elites to cause unwanted civilian populations to flee their territory so that they can then secure it. I think this is what happened in Israel in 1948, leading to what's called the Nakba. A couple of recent studies of German frontline units on the Eastern Front concluded that despite openly racist and violent, despite the openly racist and violent regime that was the Third Reich, institutional and unit cultures within the German army were a much more important element in the participation of German soldiers in genocidal killing. In other words, organizational structures and attitudes can have a tremendous impact on the behavior of troops. In the case of the Wehrmacht, it wasn't Nazi ideology that was the main explanation for its participation in mass killing, but rather the fact that the German army accepted and embraced a philosophy of all means justify the ends. The second remark is that regimes don't need the approval necessarily of broad swathes of their community in order to carry out mass killing or genocide, since the killing is almost invariably carried out by a small group of people, either in the military or in paramilitary organizations. There are exceptions to the rule, of course. There is widespread participation of civilians in killing operations, has occurred in 4 instances that I can think of in the modern era: the partition of India in 1947, the anti-communist massacres in Indonesia in 1965, during some episodes of mass killing in communist China during the Cultural Revolution, and the Rwandan genocide of 1994. The third observation I'd like to make is, although political scientists tend to agree that the decision to kill civilians is a last resort strategy born out of desperation, after other strategies have failed and only entered into reluctantly, I would contest this view. In some instances, massacres occur almost as soon as the conflict begins, and we see this on the Eastern Front during the Second World War. Then finally, as a general rule, individual perpetrators of mass killing often have only the vaguest and most simplistic sense of why they are taking part in the killing in the first place. There seems to be an extraordinary level of compliance involved here, possibly something that we will always have trouble comprehending. So as we've seen, it doesn't take, I would suggest, it doesn't take all that much for ordinary people to kill in large numbers in the right set of circumstances. But in order for that to occur in a systematic way, political and military elites have to enable killing as a tool of terror in order to achieve their political and military objectives. And they always have to dress that killing in some kind of justificatory narrative. And that's what we as historians really need to be on the lookout for. Thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you, Philip, for a fascinating paper. And I apologize for my slight delay. I was frantically writing notes as you were as you're speaking. Okay, so our next presenter is Dr. Roger Markwick, is Honorary Professor of Modern European History at the University of Newcastle, Australia. In 2003, he won the Alexander Nov Prize in Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet studies. His latest research is on socialist dissidents in the Soviet and post-Soviet states. He is also editing a biography of the Bulgarian socialist Christian Rakovsky, who became Trotsky's closest friend during the Balkan Wars. And the title of his paper today is An Orientalist Marxism, Lenin-Trotsky on Violence and Imperialism in the Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and thank you for organising this forum. So, can I just say that this is my first foray into Balkan history, but Sasha mentioned Christian Rakovsky, so I was trying to make a bit of a bridge, actually, between that particular project, which is really only just getting underway after some considerable time, and the question of the Balkans in particular, or the demise of the Ottoman Empire. But more specifically, the paper that I'm presenting today was triggered by what I regard as a really very interesting, very nuanced, critical reading of Leon Trotsky's correspondence on the Balkan Wars, 1912, 1913. That critical reading is by the Bulgarian historian very esteemed historian, Maria Todorova, who wrote this critique back in 2013. Now, she is the famous author of Imagining the Balkans, which came out in 1997, and which was inspired by, in part at least, by Edward Said's Orientalism, and also an author by the name of Milica Bakic-Haydn, who came up with the concept of nesting Orientalisms. Out of this really arose, I think, Maria Todorova's notion of what she called nesting Balkanisms, effectively a discourse that she described as the Balkans simultaneously being part of Europe, but at the same time having a darker side. And that is, in effect, the Balkans are an other, so to speak, within the European context, if you like. The context, though, in which this book was written, I think is very interesting, although written well before her commentary on Trotsky in particular. That is, the book Imagining the Balkans was actually written during the so-called Third Balkan Wars in the 1990s, when, of course, the former Yugoslavia was ripped asunder and war broke out between communities, seemingly national communities. And in that context, then, she set out to critique stereotypes of a world that was inherently atavistic, characterized by intercommunal, non-European violence. I guess that means really uncivilized violence in some way or other. Hence, then, her critical, but again, very insightful reading of Trotsky's correspondence from the Balkan Wars, the pre-World War I Balkan Wars. Just to turn to Trotsky himself, it's surprising he was only 33 at the time when he went as a war correspondent for the socialist newspaper Kievskaya Mysl, which means Kievan Thought, in October 1912 to cover both the first Balkan War and then the second Balkan War. Now, which was the first was essentially the Balkan League of small states against the Ottoman Empire. The second, very quickly, Bulgaria actually falling out with its erstwhile allies and then going to war against them and losing rather badly, actually. So, in Todorova's own words, Trotsky provided brilliant depictions of the driving forces, key political players, and life and death experiences in the Balkan Wars, in the Balkan theatre. Todorova notes, not in passing, notes, in fact, and emphasizes Trotsky's hostility towards Slavophilism, and also, at the same time, what she describes, rightly, I think, his heart-rending descriptions of wartime horror, especially in this case, atrocities perpetrated by the Serb forces and Bulgarians against Ottoman Turks. But in praising Trotsky for that, at the same time, she takes issue with what she sees as Trotsky's contempt for the Balkans, his depiction of what he describes as a backward peasant society of Kleinstaaterei, of small states that he basically regards as unviable. And she suggests that he expresses a certain degree of contempt derived, she thinks, from classical Marxism, or at least maybe a European condescension, something like that. I should note that she does not actually explicitly accuse Trotsky of Eurocentrism, Balkanism, her terminology, or Orientalism. I'm the one who introduced Orientalism and Eurocentrism, and in a way I'm still playing with, in fact, I am still playing with those concepts and the utility of them in terms of what Trotsky was doing in his this exercise. Now, Just to put you a little bit more in the historical context, Trotsky himself, having led the 1905 uprising in St. Petersburg, the Soviet there and so forth, managed to escape, and he ends up in liberal Vienna, as it was described, in the period leading up to the Balkan Wars. He's there from 1907 to 1912. And his distinguished and famous biographer, Isaac Deutscher, described Trotsky as the most European of the many Russian exiles that were there. What he meant by that's not really clear to me, and maybe it says more about Deutscher himself than Trotsky. But it should be said, it's true, that he was European, I guess, that is Trotsky, in the sense that he was a classic Marxist internationalist, that he looked to the industrial working class of advanced capitalist Europe, and particularly Germany, to crown what he believed was the forthcoming socialist revolution. This, of course, is the person who goes on to be famous for his concept of a permanent revolution, one in which a revolution could, unlike the classic sort of Marxist perspective, could begin in a backward country and then move. That could trigger revolutions in advanced capitalist countries. But critically important is, from his perspective, is that the peasantry in particular was incapable of leading anti-feudal or anti-capitalist revolutions. That task he was insistent upon fell to the industrial working classes. So it's interesting in this regard then to see his perspectives on the Ottoman Empire. He wrote a little bit about that before he actually went to become the war correspondent in the Balkans. And on that basis, for example, he welcomed the 1908 so-called Turkish Revolution, his words. But his comments about the Ottoman Empire themselves, I think, are very interesting and have pertinence in relation to his view of the Balkan states and their role in this conflict. And I quote, he says of the Ottoman Empire, "From time immemorial, this country has been a byword for stagnation, lifelessness, and despotism. The peasants," he said, "enslaved, ignorant, prey to superstition. This was," he said, "a state that was in complete decay," is the way he put it. So we could perhaps see this as a kind of Orientalism already embedded in his thinking. But if so, it's not, I would suggest, certainly not the outlook of a European imperialist, given that that was his raison d'etre as a Marxist. Although Said linked, especially in his second book, imperialism and Orientalism very, very closely. But we get a reflection, though, in terms of his notion of this Ottoman Empire being let's say, a society that was stagnating, a society that he basically believed lacked the internal drivers for development, then we find, for example, there, I think, echoes of Marx's old concept, Marx and Engels' old concept of the Asiatic mode of production, which Edward Said himself suggested actually echoed the concept of Western Orientalism. Now, if we turn more particularly to the Balkan states themselves, then again, we find this kind of understanding of the Balkan states and the Balkan world as reflected in his approach. The Balkan states, he tells us, were effectively, and I don't dispute this myself as far as I can see, manufactured, he says, at the 1878 Congress of Berlin. That is, essentially, he believes that these emerging Balkan states were creatures of European imperial powers, i.e. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, seeking, he argues, to devour a decaying Ottoman Empire. The result, he suggested, this is 1910, was that the Balkans were a melee of petty vassal states, dwarf states. The language is not very flattering, you'll see, and I think Todorova takes exception particularly to some of these comments, and what he refers to as pint-sized Balkan monarchies and dynasties artificially installed by European diplomacy. So they have no real life, if you like, outside of the imperial forces that are in play. And in that regard, it's interesting, I think, in particular to note that for him, the lack of a driving force is in terms of the class makeup of these states. And in particular, he draws attention, or statelets in the making, let's call them that. He draws attention to what he sees as the Balkan bourgeoisie being a product of their being late to capitalism. So capitalism is the driver for him in essentially, although he doesn't really use this term, pre-capitalist states, I'd suggest. And thus he describes the emerging bourgeoisies as something in the most unflattering terms again, sterile, cowardly, talentless, and rotten through and through with chauvinism. And by the way, we'll see that he in fact looked to these sort of the chauvinism of these the states that are emerging in the course of prior to and in the course of statelets prior to and in the course of this first Balkan War, the first phase of it, so to speak, as one of the drivers, at least, of what he sees as almost unfettered violence on the part of those involved in the conflict, and in particular, the ones he looks most closely at, and which I will look most closely at, and that is the Bulgarians in particular. Now, there's no doubt about it that Eurocentrism intrudes into Trotsky's language. If not, his thinking. So, again, I'm sure that's up for discussion. His approach really is, as one might expect, a materialist one, capitalism and social forces are the drivers of progress or otherwise. In the case of Bulgaria, again, we meet this notion, and here I'm quoting from an article of November 1912, by which time war is already underway. Bulgarians are on the offensive, the Ottomans are definitely on the retreat, suffering terrible defeats. But he speaks of its lag in historical development, low level of social differentiation, and again, of a society that was incapable of creating new political and cultural forms through a free struggle of its own inner forces. In this context, he argues, it was obliged to assimilate the cultural products that European civilization, and they're his words, has developed in the course of its history. He even says, by the way, the Bulgarians' literature lacks traditions. Again, not a very flattering image, if you like, of the Bulgarian world at this stage. And the language clearly jars when you see European civilization and so forth, or at least it jars these days. Nevertheless, when he's talking about culture, he's actually talking about things like railways, bridges, military technology. For Trotsky, socioeconomic weakness, his term, not some kind of racial feature of the Slav Bulgarians and Serbs that subordinates them particularly to Tsarist Russia. And here he sees Tsarist Russia and its Slavist plans as the driving force of particularly the Serbs and Bulgarians. That is, the development of pan-Slavism, a driving ideology, if you like, that can justify the things that can be done in its name. Let's turn, I'll turn now, though, to the wartime violence that he documented. And in fact, in this respect, he distinguished himself from almost all other observers, journalists, and commentators on the war at that time. A stream of journalists descended on the Balkans with the outbreak of war. But in the main, their perspectives were definitely coloured by Orientalism, particularly in relation to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, a backward nation, what was engaged what was really at stake here was Christian revanchism. And in that context, Balkan atrocities were ignored or silenced. And he particularly, that is, Trotsky, singles out the Bulgarians themselves, the Serbians and the Russians. And don't forget, he was a citizen of the Russian Empire. And by the way, for that reason, he wrote anonymously when he was writing these articles. This was, of course, an era, one should bear in mind, just as an aside, this was the era in which the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 were adopted in relation to war, laws of war, and war crimes. Trotsky, however, as I said in the first instance, was, again, almost alone, I think, in documenting what he regarded as hellish atrocities in what he called the bloody cookhouse of the Balkans, and especially those by Bulgarian and Serbian forces against Turks and Kurds, And in particular, in this regard, he was a pioneering oral historian, if you like, because his sources were in the main those of wounded Bulgarian soldiers and officers that he met in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. He, that is Trotsky, blamed essentially the Bulgarian military leadership for carrying out deliberately the killing of unarmed, maimed, half-dead men with bayonets on the spot, so as not to encumber the transport of the wounded. He described this as a systematic practice in which wounded and prisoners were exterminated, first in hundreds, later in thousands. They're the words of one of his interlocutors. In this regard, he also made the point that if the regular forces were driving this process, much of those atrocities that were being committed were actually carried out often as not, and in even worse terms, by irregular forces against the hapless, if you like, the defenseless Turkish wounded and POWs, and also, I should say, Turkish, or Ottoman might be a better word, Turkish and Ottoman civilians. Now, Trotsky doesn't have a specific, he doesn't try to give a specific explanation as to why this violence occurred, the violence that he was documenting. And it's worthwhile, I think, just separating out his perspective from, for example, another observer who was there at the time of similar educational level, that is a chap by the name of Otto Neurath, who was an Austrian economist and philosopher. And he spoke of wild instincts, of accumulated bitterness, the low level of development of ethnicity, that is classic Orientalist tropes about why these the savagery of seeming savagery of this, well, the savagery of this war took place. But Trotsky, I'd suggest, his perspective really comes from that social analysis that he has of the driving forces of this war. A war in which he saw petty Balkan dynasties competing for the largest share of the Ottoman Balkans. And behind that, what he sees as the role of Tsarist Russian imperialism, promoting what he sees as a chauvinist neo-Slavonic movement against Ottoman Turkey that, in his words, led to, in many cases, the systematic extermination of Muslim peoples. It's imperialist greed that he sees underlying this, and dressed up, really, justified by massacres of the people of the Crescent in the interests of the culture of the cross. All of these things, he argues, covered up and silenced by the Russians and the Bulgarians. I should say, and I need to finish, I realize, that Trotsky thought that the overthrow of Turkish rule, as he uses the word Turkish, by the way, all the time, rather than Ottoman, Turkish rule over the Slavs in the Balkans was progressive. But he made the qualification that it's not a matter of indifference by what methods this emancipation is accomplished. A very interesting comment from somebody who goes on to lead the Red Army, as Todorov points out. So let me conclude. We're talking about here who somebody was, put at least, not likely, was a young Marxist, but a man of his, a Marxist of his time, let's put it that way, who was not immune, therefore, I'd suggest, to Eurocentric prejudices, and prejudices actually that you can find reflected in Marx and Engels' own writings. He, that is Trotsky, cited from Marx and Engels' writing, for example, in 1853, when they were looking at the situation in India, for example. So he's carrying that kind of baggage. That Eurocentrism is reflected in his language, his horror at the inhumane barbarism, which he counterposes to civilization in the Balkans, the dichotomies of backwardness versus forwardness, of European versus Asiatic, and he uses that term, by the way, from time to time. But in this regard, Todorov's largely discursive critique implies that Trotsky was guilty of a kind of Eurocentric, if not Orientalist, Balkanist, contemptuous othering. Again, she doesn't use that term, but I suggest her focus on the language of Trotsky really obscures his historical and materialist approach to Balkan War's atrocities. I don't think that Trotsky was an Orientalist in the sense of, for example, as I previously quoted, and as we saw in the modern Third Balkan War, and a kind of Orientalist essentializing innate primordial violence to the people of the Balkans. Nor did he elevate Europe to the pinnacle of civilization. On the contrary, and I'll finish on this note, so I apologize for going over time. On the contrary, the future anti-war Zimmerwaldist, that is Trotsky, attributed the bloodshed in the Balkans to the machinations of European imperial powers, their Balkan acolytes, and above all, the Russian autocracy, to dismember the dying Ottoman Empire. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Roger, for a really interesting paper. Okay, so our third speaker today is Andreas Varnava, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and Professor in British Imperial and Colonial Histories at Flinders University, South Australia, and an Honorary Professor in History at De Montfort University in Leicester. He has authored 4 monographs, edited or co-edited 16 collections, and published over 60 articles or chapters in a wide range of different publications. His paper today is titled Post-British or Post-Ottoman? Mass Violence in Cyprus, 1963 to 1974.
Thank you, Sasha. Can you hear me okay? Right,
Yep.
I'm going to try and share my screen so I can present using the PowerPoint. How's that?
Great. Perfect.
That's a miracle. Okay, so let me start by looking at the abstract here. Let me just minimize this. Good. From December 1963 to August 1974, Cyprus was gripped by an on and off again political violence, I would say civil war, involving Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot, Greek and Turkish forces, which led to many casualties and the forced geographical separation or partition of the population owing to ethnic cleansing. The mass violence is usually classified as an example of post-British or post-imperial violence and partition, with the replacement of the British by the Americans from 1964. Thus, it has also been seen through the prism of the Cold War. This paper builds on this research by adding an additional dimension by viewing these events as also being an example of late post-Ottoman mass violence. It starts by focusing on the British colonial period to establish the post-Ottoman characteristics that evolved before showing how many of these lingered and were at the heart of the mass violence from 63 to 74. I'm going to start with some background and then move into the structure that you can see there, defining the violence from 63 to 74 as colonial or post-colonial, British or post-British, and then moving into post-Ottoman Cyprus pre the violence, pre-55, post-Ottoman violence during the colonial times in 55 to 59, and then the period after, from 63 to 74. But I need to sort of establish that earlier period to show you the continuities. So the background very quickly, the Ottoman period, the Ottoman occupation begins in 1570, it runs until 1878, occupied from the Venetians. The Catholic population is either killed or flees or converts to Islam. Muslims are settled, and the Orthodox Church is elevated to prominence as the only Christian authority in the island, and really it's co-opted into the governing system. And I'll come back to that later on. During the British period, 1878 to 1960, to clarify, Cyprus comes under British occupation and administration in 1878, but remains under Ottoman sovereignty until 1914, when the Ottomans enter the war on the side of the Central Powers, and it's at that point that the British annex it. It's not until 1924 that the new Turkey recognizes British sovereignty and abandons any claims to Cyprus in the Treaty of Lausanne, and then following year, Cyprus becomes a crown colony. Fast forwarding, from 1955 to 59, there's a period of violence, sometimes referred to as the Cyprus Emergency or the Anti-Colonial War, or even the Greek Cypriot War of Independence. Of course, it wasn't about independence because the group, EOKA, which was a far right-wing nationalist group, aimed for enosis, that is, the union of Cyprus with Greece, and not independence. The Turkish Defense Force, known as TMT, aimed for partition. Independence was a compromise, and what was created was a consociational republic, which was guaranteed by Britain, Greece, and Turkey. I'll come back to that again later as well. And the Republican period from 1960 until today, well, in 1960, Cyprus became an independent republic. The constitution collapsed in December of 63. We have the start of a civil war. The island is de facto partitioned. And then in 1974, de facto partitioned into two sides after a Greek coup and the Turkish invasion. The map I'm showing you now shows you the distribution of the ethnic groups, primarily the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriot. The Maronites are just in that green area there. What I wanted to show you is that the Greek and Turkish Cypriot populations are interspersed throughout the island. There is no one area or even two areas or whatever in which they primarily populate. And the partition that occurred in 1974 basically created these two sides, in which there's a substantial movement of populations in order to create these two, one Turkish Cypriot side and one Greek Cypriot side. Okay, defining the violence between 63 and 74. Well, there are three rounds of violence. December of 63 to about August of 1964. There's a brief period of violence in 1967, and then there is 1974. The violence is characterized by small-scale massacres, hostage-taking, random and indiscriminate attacks causing death and injury, and ethnic cleansing or geographical separation. The period when violence subsides, namely between 64 and 67, and then between 67 and 74, is characterized by the Turkish Cypriots living in a state of siege, lacking supplies, reliant on aid, mainly from Turkey. And then in the violence from 63 to 64, this was triggered when Archbishop Makarios, proposed 13 amendments to the constitution that diluted the Turkish Cypriot protections and rights within the consociational system. Now, most research backs the positions of one side or the other to varying degrees. And these positions are, well, the Greek Cypriots claim that the Turkish Cypriots revolted in December of 63 to bring about a geographical separation of the two communities to facilitate partition. The Turkish Cypriots argue that the Greek Cypriots attempted to implement the so-called Akritas plan to bring about enosis by repressing Turkish Cypriots through violence and even a genocide. The truth is something a little bit like this. Well, the Greek Cypriots initiated the clashes to implement the Akritas plan, basically to force the Turkish Cypriots to the table, to accept those 13 amendments. While the Turkish Cypriots were prepared for clashes to start in 1964 and did plan to, a form of geographical separation in the hope of the Turkey intervening. Now, recent research that I've done with Tim Mansueto argues that the period from 63 to 67 has the features of a civil war and suggests that 1974 also does. And we propose that the entire period should be considered as one civil war period with different rounds of hot violence and cold violence. The period of 1974 is somewhat complicated by the fact that there is a coup by the Greek military junta in Athens, in Cyprus, toppling the regime of Makarios, which triggers the invasion. But we also must see the involvement of Greece and Turkey in terms of the fact, well, the Greek Cypriots wanted to unite with Greece, identify with Greece, and the Turkish Cypriots wanted partition, and therefore also known as double enosis, by the way, with Turkey, so they identify with Turkey. So it's perhaps not as complicated as one might think. But also there are other things happening in 1974, which I would say are characteristics of a more traditional civil war as well. Let me introduce you to this slide with Anita Dimitriou, who is the president of the House of Representatives in the Republic of Cyprus, but also the leader of the center-right wing VC party since this year, in which she is basically referring to the 14th of August 1974, which is the second phase of the Operation Attilas, the Turkish invasion, coming to, as she says, Famagusta and Morphu. We must continue to work for the freedom and reunification of our homeland, respecting the refugees, the mothers of the missing, and our heroes. And I draw your attention to the photo because that photo has nothing to do with 1974 and is in fact a photo by Don McCullen at Gaziveran in Cyprus of Nevcihan Olusum, which was published in The Observer on the 20th of March 1964 and was the World Press Photo of the Year in that year. So you can see here the propaganda, the use and misuse of photos, a photo from 1964, being used to argue a position in 1974, and also, clearly cannot distinguish between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Next, I have a table here showing the displaced persons from 1963-64. You can see here that the majority are Turkish Cypriots, around 25,000, which is around 24% of the Turkish Cypriot population. There's also a substantial proportion of Armenian Cypriots who were displaced during that round of violence. The table on expulsions indicates from 74 this time indicates again substantial numbers in this case: 155,000 Greek Cypriots, 60,000 Turkish Cypriots, 4,000 Maronite Cypriots, and 1,000 Armenian Cypriots. You can see there that around a third of the Greek Cypriots were displaced, and half of the Turkish Cypriots were displaced. The deaths and missing from 1974, you can see here that this is an ongoing thing. So when you read there, there's those that were classified as dead more or less from the time, and then there is those who I've said there are missing in inverted commas, but that have since been determined to be dead. Their remains have been located, and then those who are still missing, these figures are changing all the time because of the work of the Committee on Missing Persons. So you can see here that in overall there's just over 4,000 who were killed during that round of violence in 1974. And here is a table of massacres in 1974. omitted to include one for 63, 64, although there was some small-scale massacres. The largest one in 74 was Aloha Maratha, and I should have had there Sandalar and Famagusta, of around 126 women, children, and elderly Turkish Cypriots by Greek Cypriot militia, namely Elka B, which had been formed and had been used by the Greek junta to overthrow the government of Makarios. This is a photo from the time when one of the mass graves was discovered, and the Turkish Cypriot prays where they found 86 Turkish Cypriot bodies. And you can see that there are photojournalists on the scene as well, and the UN. This is a UN photo. Okay, so let's go back to look at the period between 1955 and 59, the violence as colonial or British. Well, the violence predates the post-colonial Republican period. From the 1880s, basically the British encouraged Orthodox Cypriots to call themselves, Romni or Romans, to believe that they were Greeks, and for the Muslim Cypriots to believe that they were Turks. That this was done through various means, the education system and so forth. In 1912, we have minor Christian-Muslim clashes in Cyprus over the Balkan Wars. In 1929, we have the formation of the far-right secret armed organization known as EREK to bring about immediate enosis as something that's anti-British, extreme nationalist, far-right, even fascist group. In 1931, there are disturbances against the economic downturn, mixed with Greek nationalist riots, leading to the burning of Government House in Nicosia and attacks on other government buildings and infrastructure. The British suspended constitution and implemented crackdown. 1934, the remnants of EREK, because most of them have been sent abroad, exiled, they seemingly assassinate Antonios Triantafylidis, a leading politician, for wanting to rebuild relations with the British to lay the foundations for enosis in the future. In 1950, by now, both the far right and far left view enosis as national liberation from the British. Self-government under the British and independence are now both rejected by both the left and the right. Then in 1951, EOKA was formed in Athens from former EREK members, now also Archbishop Makarios III, and the right-wing Greek army personnel. They recruit Colonel Grievous, who is the leader of the HI organization during the German occupation of Greece and the Greek Civil War, an extreme right-wing, far right-wing group, to run the armed campaign for enosis. Grievous was a Cypriot, but hadn't lived in Cyprus for most of his life. In 1955, we have the armed campaign started against the British. The British respond in a similar way as in Kenya, with policing, high military presence, concentration camps, practicing torture. There were hangings, curfews, and so forth. The British deployed divide and rule by encouraging Turkish Cypriots in Turkey against Greek Cypriots in Greece to combat EOKA and the demand for enosis. The British do not propose independence as a solution, but a series of plans that try to retain Cyprus under British sovereignty. Turkish Cypriots initially demanded a continuation of British rule, which is quite unusual, but then they fall behind supporting partition. Both ideas are clearly rooted in British imperialism. This is the cover of my book on the assassination that I mentioned earlier and the origins of EOKA. The 1963-74 violence is pro-British. Well, here we have Greek and Turkish Cypriots and those that support their official propaganda narratives blaming the British and the Americans for the violence and the de facto partition. The British are blamed for creating the conditions by practicing divide and rule from the day they stepped foot in Cyprus. As for the conflict in 63, 64, and 67, the British are blamed for the outbreaks and the continued violence. The Turkish Cypriots blame the High Commissioner, the British High Commissioner, for encouraging the Greek Cypriot amendments, which were proposed on the 30th of November of 63. The Greek Cypriots blame the British for trying to keep both sides apart, for drawing the Green Line in Nicosia. Both sides blame the British for failing to sort things out at London Conference in January of 64. After this, the US replaces the British as the main Western power trying to resolve the crisis, but always they're sort of now referred to as the Anglo-Americans, are blamed conjointly for the crisis in 67, and the same as well in 1974 for not stopping the Turkish invasion. Often the partition of Cyprus is considered by many as inevitable, since the British seem to leave other places partitioned, British India, Palestine, and so forth. Here is an example of some of this. In March of 1964, thousands of Greeks marched through the streets of Athens to the American and British embassies to denounce the attitude of the two nations on Cyprus. Here shown placing the Ottoman fez hats on the British embassy, as if to say the British are Turks. English get out of Cyprus, an anti-British slogan by Greek Cypriots demonstrating in front of Parliament House in Athens in 1974, as if to say that, you know, the coup that had occurred and other problems that didn't, weren't part of the problem, that the real problem is the British, so get out of Cyprus. That also probably refers to the fact that the British have bases in Cyprus. Here is an anti-NATO demonstration in Sydney in 1974. So again, sort of the blame is being attributed to the Anglo-Americans. Okay, so now to show the Ottoman dimension here. So post-Ottoman Cyprus, 1878 to 1960, Ottoman sovereignty is still there until 1914, even though the Ottoman Empire doesn't relinquish its sovereignty until 1924. The British rule did make many changes, but also kept many Ottoman policies and practices. For instance, laws, many Ottoman laws still existed well into the 1920s. Just the other day, completely different project discovered that the Ottoman tobacco law was only replaced in 1927. Another example, the Cyprus tribute that the UK promised to the Ottoman Empire back in 1878, but which it retained because of the defaulted Ottoman Crimean War loan, continued to be taken until 1928, well after the Ottoman Empire had ended. Class, another example, late Ottoman Cyprus consisted basically of 80% peasants, 10 to 15% rural laborers, and 3 to 5% middle class, maybe 1 or 2% elite. Little changed in the first 45 years of British rule. By the mid-1920s, peasant numbers may have decreased, laborers may have increased. We have new types of laborers in industries such as mines and manufacturing under the British. And the educated elite also grow, yet there is an estimation in a report in 1930 that 80% of the population was on the poverty line or below it. So not a great deal is changing. In terms of identity, officially, the Orthodox Christians were referred to as non-Mohammedans by the British, although privately they referred to them as Greeks, and the Muslims were Mohammedans. Orthodox Christians still called themselves Romans or Romni, changing to Greeks as by the elites and the education system, though many still called themselves Romni into the 1970s, while the process for the Muslims changing to Turks was even slower. Orthodox Christians essentially become Greeks, Muslims become Turks based on, now this is all based on the Ottoman system of religious identities, and it's a very slow process for this to transition into more national identities based on ethnicity, although I would say ethno-religious identities. Independence, British, Greek, and Turkish guarantee of the new republic. This is also something that I think goes back to the 1820s and 30s with the guarantee of the Greek states. There's a similar sort of guarantee here, although in that case it was between Britain, France, and Russia. The other thing I want to talk about is the idea of ethnarch, the ethnarch leadership that developed under the Ottomans and transformed from 1900 as the Archbishop of Cyprus adopted ethno-religious nationalism and enosis as a counter to the British rule and the Turkish demographic minority. Now, Makarios III took this to the next level with his international approach to the situation. And I'll pick that up in a moment when we look at the post-1960 period and how that continues. Independence, consociational system of government that was adopted in 1960 was rooted in the Ottoman millet system, as it recognized two politically equal communities based on their ethno-religious identities, the Greeks and the Turks. Even the other demographic minorities, the Maronites, the Armenians, they had to decide whether they belonged to the Greek community or to the Turkish community. British, Greek, and Turkish guarantee of a constitution, as I said, was similar to the guaranteeing of the Greek state. More about the development of the Archbishop Ethnarch role can be found in this edited volume that I did about 10 years ago now, I reckon. Now, the violence between 55 and 59 as post-Ottoman, well, we have to understand that EOKA was rooted in Erek, which formed in 1929 as this anti-Britishness expressed through a combination of fascism and extreme nationalism, but rooted in 19th century Greek irredentism, the idea of the great idea, and also the clandestine nature of the organization and proposed use of arms mimicked the Filikiyeteria, or the friendly society of the 1820s, which led the Greek War of Independence. EOKA was modeled on Erek, therefore on the Greek friendly society as well. EOKA has wider support than Erek. It has support from forces in Greece. Enosis and its broader ideology and violence camouflaged its anti-colonial, was camouflaged as anti-colonial, I should say, but in reality was rooted in 19th century Greek irredentism and the great idea. It's only anti-colonial insofar as the British stand in the way of Enosis. Its own propaganda linked EOKA constantly to the Filikiyeteria and to the Greek War of Independence, including in its first revolutionary leaflet, the use of the terms Enosis as a struggle, just like in the Greek War of Independence. EOKA's motto was death or victory. The motto for the Filikiyeteria was victory or death. The Filikiyeteria was a product of the Ottoman Empire, while EOKA seems to have been a product of both the Ottoman and British empires in Cyprus. The Turkish Cypriots are the most obvious visible connection to the Ottoman Empire, being Muslims and considering themselves Turks. Always opposed Enosis, initially wanting the continuation of British rule, then arguing that Cyprus had previously belonged to the Ottoman Empire and so should be returned to Turkey or partitioned. Its armed resistance through TMT to EOKA followed the Ottoman pattern of secret unit in the Ottoman army because of the role of the Turkish army here, though now we have also the Cold War context, but that also applies to EOKA as well. Here is an EOKA propaganda flag, co-opting the flag of the Greek War of Independence. Here we have this guy, Yannis Peyotis, who is celebrating this, by the way, celebrating the links between EOKA and the Greek War of Independence in an article only just published about a year ago. Now, the 1963-74 violence is post-Ottoman. Well, there are numerous continuities. First of all, the armed groups that we discussed, EOKA and TMT, they continue. We have the identities that we've discussed before, the ethno-religious identities, they continue. And also the ethnarchism, that continues. In fact, it goes to the next level, as we will see. The armed groups, well, TMT continues largely unchanged. Meanwhile, EOKA does splinter into unofficially supported Akritas organization under the Minister of Interior, Poligarchos Yorkagis, and other smaller groups that Makarios, I'll say beyond, more than just tolerates them, he allows them to exist. Identities, well, the constitution recognizes just two communities, Greeks and Turks, based on ethno-religious criteria. It follows the Ottoman millet system and the British system. The constitution further enshrines ethno-religious identities through the communal chambers, which allowed the communities to propagate Greek and Turkish national identities and histories, as opposed to, Cypriot ones, and indeed these hatreds as well. Ethnarchism. Well, Makarios consolidates the role of the ethnarch by becoming president. Would have been great that I can, put up an image of Makarios and probably, as far as I know, the only other religious head to become head of state and head of government that I can think of anyway, and perhaps you can correct me, in the world, and that is the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. So this goes back to the Ottoman Empire, where religion was at the forefront of the administration. It blends, or he did, it blended ethnarchism with EOKA to create what I've called in other publications an eokatokratia. In other words, the country is held by Eoka, which is a play on the Greek Cypriots and Greeks talking about Turkokratia, or held by the Turks during Ottoman rule. Makarios did not accept independence as a permanent solution in 1958 when he first accepted it, when he first proposed it. He authorized the formation of the Akritas organization. He proposed the 13 constitutional changes, and he authorized the start of the clashes on the eve of Christmas 63, all trying to achieve enosis. Here he is here, the Archbishop, viewing armored vehicles of the Cypriot security forces on Eoka Day in 1964. And here too, Orthodox priests in Athens waving an Eoka flag. And that's another reason why I've included the photo. You can see Cyprus in the middle there of an old traditional sort of Greek flag. Now, the 1963-74 violence is post-Ottoman. Well, geographical separation and ethnic cleansing. Well, if partition is a post-Ottoman, is a post-British phenomenon, then ethnic cleansing is certainly post-British and post-Ottoman. The Cypriot case has specific post-Ottoman features. The clash between Greek irredentism and imperialism to create a greater Greece, and Turkish nationalist desires to protect Turkish Muslim communities through geographical separation and expulsions was a feature of the Turkish War of Independence. There is even an agreed exchange of populations in Cyprus in 1974 along sort of similar lines to the one agreed to in 1920s. Like the Turkish War of Independence, the conflict in Cyprus also becomes one over territory and who should control it. Greece through enosis, Turkey through partition, the Greek Cypriots through the Republic of Cyprus, which is the only internationally recognized government in Cyprus since 1964, or the Turkish Cypriots through the TRNC, which remains internationally unrecognized. So, conscious, I've sort of probably gone over time. In conclusion, the Cypriot Civil War between 63 and 74 must be understood as arising from both post-British and post-Ottoman imperial legacies. The post-Ottoman imperial legacies include the ethno-religious identity formation. I want to emphasize that I see this more in terms of the Greek Cypriots rather than as much with the Turkish Cypriots, who I think have a secular, stronger secularization. The great idea, the ideology of a greater Greece, lingers during the Republican period after it had well and truly ended in Greece, which clashes with Turkish nationalism and the protection of the Turkish Cypriot minority, demographic minority. Eoka and the Greek War of Independence, well, this lingers into the Republican period. It's still strong today. The Cypriot national anthem is the same national anthem of Greece, which is the Hymn to Liberty, which was written by Dionysios Solomos for the Greek War of Independence. Ethnarchism, the new state, especially from 64, sees religion and state combined in Makarios, who enshrines Greek nationalism and the worship of the Greek heroes of 1821 with the Eoka heroes, and appoints Eoka cadres as ministers and advisors. As I've said before, this is what I've termed Eokatokratia. The geographical separation is, as a consequence of the armed conflict and violence, again, has particularly echoes of the post-Ottoman period. The ethnic cleansing and partition, also here, I would say, a feature of both post-British and post-Ottoman empires. So I think that, although this is rather an exploratory sort of paper, I think I've hopefully made the case that there are post-Ottoman legacies connected to the violence or civil war between 63 and 74. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrakis, for a really interesting paper. Okay, and if I could ask you, yeah, perfect, thank you. So we've had 3 really interesting papers, and we've got some time for questions. Lucas.
Of course, thank you very much for these papers. And of course, there are a lot of issues and questions, but first one or and I do not monopolize the word to Roger. I think I would like to know more about Trotsky's vision for the future of the Balkan. So my take on Trotsky, I've read his book on the Balkan Wars in German. And what I found interesting is that also he's very critical of the Young Turks. He says that they are reactionaries. They do not see the benefits of a democratic federal solution. So that's the young Trotsky. Of course, he has not the same, let's say, ideals or to the same extent, but he seems, and that's the spirit of the Second International, of course, to take very seriously democracy at that time also. And he is very bluntly against those who do not believe, and that's interesting, he said then, in the best counter-argument against, I quote him, pseudo-realistic, that's his language, skepticism against federal democracy, he then quotes the United States and Switzerland. So it's not only that he's against imperialism or Western, but he has also some positive references. So because I think he's so, as you also, I think, tried to show, he's a very sensitive and open-minded observer of his time, despite some, let's say, coloration by Eurocentrism or this or that. Nevertheless, it is remarkable what he saw, but also what he thought. And so I would like to know more about his vision then of Balkan future. If that pops up in his correspondence that I do not know.
Yes. Okay. Actually, yeah, if I could just touch on that first comment, Hans Lucas, that you made about his view of the Young Turks. I did find that I dipped into that some time ago. It's very interesting the way he sees the Young Turks in the context of emerging from this backward, underdeveloped Ottoman Empire, and he says essentially that they really made up of primarily the armed forces, an officer corps, but they have no intention of driving, really of driving progress in Turkey, because they're afraid that they might unleash, these are my words, but they don't have real social forces behind them that can provide the kind of dynamism that he envisages. And he also says, forgive me if I'm just repeating part of what you said, but he sees them as very centralist. I mean, maybe that's an obvious point to make, but not, they won't allow for any kind of decentralization. And that, I think, means that then Balkans that they can't control, that is starting to fall apart from centrifugal forces, if you like, nationalist forces and so forth, is a very great danger for them. On the Balkans specifically, he says these states, or statelets, my words, not his really, but I guess that's what he meant, are not viable in their own right. What he wants to see is, he proposes, and I think actually this is a prefiguring of Yugoslavia under Tito, maybe even the interwar Yugoslavia, but particularly under Tito, post-Second World War, some sort of confederation. That's the only way he sees them as having viability. And he's very emphatic at this point in these years, bearing in mind it's before the Russian well before the real Russian Revolution, if you like. He's very puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of democratic forms, as I think as giving breathing space to those forces he sees as potentially having the potential to drive some kind of progressive change and not just be led by essentially corrupt dynasties that are dependent on external forces. And then when he looks at Bulgaria in particular, there he sees, for example, this won't surprise anybody here, the social democrats that are developing there as a particularly important force. And that's the role. For example, Christian Rakovsky was an important figure at this stage in that movement. I'll leave it there.
Alexander, and then Umit.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I apologize for coming late to this panel, but I was teaching, so I've come as quickly as I can. I think I caught most of Andreikos's paper, and I was a little bit, I couldn't help but noticing that you used a lot of passive voice in the way you talked about blame. You said blame was assigned to the British, and blame was ascribed to the British, and there was never any agent assigning the blame in the way you phrased your comments. And I couldn't help but assuming that the blame being assigned was being assigned by Greeks. And I wondered if you tended to look at, I was speculating that if you looked at what Turkish Cypriots had to say, you might get a different position, that the Turkish Cypriots would be blaming the Turks, or would be blaming the Greeks for the violence. You think about, the Greeks, take Atticus and they ethnically cleanse all the Turks. The Greeks take Crete and ethnically cleanse the Turks. The Greeks take Macedonia, ethnically cleanse the Turks. No wonder the Turks are afraid of this Greek violence. And, isn't there a Greek bit of blame? You blame the British, you blame the Ottomans. The Greeks are totally blameless, raising their armies, but no responsibility for violence whatsoever. What are your thoughts?
So yes, I mentioned before, I think it was at the beginning, that the two sides and how they view, one blaming the other for the violence. In terms of the British and the Anglo-American blame, it is primarily Greek Cypriots that blame the Anglo-Americans, although there are left-wing Turkish Cypriots who also blame what happened. They don't necessarily blame the violence, although they sometimes attribute the Greek Cypriot violence to being encouraged by the Anglo-Americans as well. So there both sides, to varying degrees, more so the Greek Cypriots, blame the Anglo-Americans. I think the work of Yannis Stefanidis is important here, because he's published quite a bit, both on Cyprus and on Greece more generally, and the attitudes of the Greeks in general, both the general population and the politicians, particularly the populism of, the Pan-Hellenist movement, and so Pan-Hellenist socialist movement and so forth, that had this anti-American sort of slant to it as well, within its nationalism. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, Umit.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much for very compelling presentations. I have a question for Philip. So I have been working on and pondering about the motivations of perpetrators within the context of late Ottoman Empire and early Turkish Republican period. Of course, always trying to find parallels and making some convergences or divergences with the other cases, mass violent events like Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide and so forth. As you really have set the tone beautifully for us in terms of the explicating and also introducing a variety of various forms of motivations and so forth in different cases. But still, I'm always stuck with the fact that, I mean, what is the most vocal and pronouncing one in all these, you know, motivations? Because at the end of the day, as if we are all making the same points. Okay, ideology plays a role, and the obedience to the superior authorities and the fear and so forth play a role, and economic motivations plays a role. But is it convenient or viable to make an argument that that aspect, that independent variable, plays the most significant or pivotal role in the destruction of victim groups, or the most vocal motivation for the perpetrators, both I mean, at the elite level and also grassroots level? What would you say about that? I'm really curious about your point of view towards that issue.
Yeah, for me, it's still a bit of a conundrum. I have been reading quite a bit. So this pendulum has obviously swung away from the individual psychologizing that used to take place in the 60s and 70s and right up through to the 80s, although there are still works by social psychologists who look at individual perpetration and why people take part in these mass killings. But in terms of sociology, political science, and history, the pendulum has swung right away from that towards these broader strategic ideological factors. When Leader Maynard, for example, talks about the role of ideology in perpetration, he means that as broad, in a very broad sense. So we're not talking about a political indoctrination as we might think of it, not Marxism or Nazism or whatever. He's thinking of these other cultural, societal factors that play upon people's prejudices and fears towards minority groups within societies, but which is different again to the types of explanations that we find in the demonization of the other, which have been around for some decades now as well. I find those kinds of structural, societal explanations, and they all admit, whether it's Moses or Lena Maynard or Sinisa Milicevic, they all admit that there's obviously a variety of factors at play, and that sometimes individuals have motives other than ideology. They might be advancing their own careers. They might be quite cynical and about in you know what they're doing. But I deep down inside of me, I find these explanations wanting, because having a belief does not mean that you are going to go out and kill. So the thing that really perplexes me and puzzles, being something I've been trying to get my head around for some years now, is what enables the individual, and usually they're men, to pull the trigger even when they're up close and it's very personal and they can see that the person is going to die, whether it's a baby or a woman or an old man or whatever, but they are able to pull the trigger and kill. And I come back to Browning's explanation, where peer pressure, the in-group bonding, the prevalence of particular notions of masculinity and what it is to be a man, fear of letting others think that you're weak. These societal pressures are actually much stronger than what we might call ideology in motivating people to take part in these mass killings. It takes an enormous amount of personal and moral courage to step away and say, no, I'm not going to do this. And very few people in the end do that. Most go along with it. And I think that, psychologists have also looked at this. Once you've crossed that moral boundary and you've taken part in a killing, no matter how repulsive you might find it, it's too late to walk back after that. You'll continue to do it, because to not do so is to somehow admit to yourself that you've done something terribly wrong. And how do you live with that in your conscience afterwards? What I really, sorry, I'm going on a little bit. here. But the other thing I find really interesting is the extent to which perpetrators have a sense of guilt in the years after the mass killings, and we don't find it. I don't know if this is the case among the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire. I don't think we find it among many Nazis. I don't think we find it among many Khmer Rouge, because there is a kind of acceptance that what they did for some greater good, or because they were told to do so. So the responsibility, any kind of moral responsibility, is simply taken away from them. We find it, however, among many veterans American veterans who were in Vietnam and who committed atrocities and who are unable to face what they did when they came back to their societies because they found it unacceptable. So I think that's sort of an aspect of the aftermath of mass violence that possibly hasn't been adequately looked at enough yet. I'm not sure, but it's interesting to see how people self-justify what they've done. Sorry, I'm all over the shop there with a response, but I'm not entirely convinced by ideology as an explanation, no matter how we define it.
Okay, Sebastian, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. So my question is for Andrekos. I was struck in the presentation how much Ottoman Cyprus resembled the Ottoman Balkan provinces economically. So both were sort of clearly peripheral regions. They remained very unindustrialized. They had sort of 80% peasant agrarian populations. And I know that in Bulgaria, for example, there was a sense of disenfranchisement that added to a long-term sense of disdain towards what we could call an Ottoman vision of the Turks. Is there evidence of a similar sort of sense occurring in Cyprus, or does British involvement in Cyprus quickly displace those animosities to a large extent? I'm sort of interested specifically in Greek Cypriot opinion from 63 to 74.
I mean, the British sort of, no, they don't. I mean, it doesn't change. The Greek Cypriots, as time goes on, continue to view the Ottoman Empire and its role in Cyprus very negatively. That's part of the broader Greek view of the Ottoman Empire, which is a nationalist, revisionist reinterpretation of the realities of the Ottoman system. In the first period after the British arrive, there is still, because of the role of the church, and I mentioned ethnarch and ethnarchism, the Archbishop of Cyprus, for example, between, for the last decade or so of Ottoman rule and the first 2 decades of British rule, he was one of the longest serving archbishops, Archbishop Sophronius. He didn't really have a negative view of the Ottoman Empire. He welcomed the British, but he didn't demand union with Greece, and he didn't understand others who supported that idea, and he didn't believe in nationalism. He thought it was contrary to Orthodox Christianity. And he basically, I mean, he wanted the judiciary to be reformed, which the British did reform, but he didn't generally have negative views of the Ottoman Empire. But from 1900, that really does ramp up as we have basically one after the other, a continuous stream of Greek nationalist archbishops, really transforming the role of ethnarch. And it's all within the Greek education system, which is entirely controlled by the communities. The British played a very little role in directing education in Cyprus, and this continues from 1960 during the Republican period, and primarily through these communal chambers, which I mentioned, which is an unusual way of or an unusual element within the constitution, the way they separated communal affairs and put them in the control of the two communities in this way.
I'm going to leap in and use my prerogative as a panel chair. A question for Roger. Bulgaria in particular had a really lively agrarian sort of cooperative movement and a political movement, Banu, which ends up forming government for a brief period after the First World War before it gets basically taken out in a coup. And what I'm wondering is, I get that Trotsky's always going to favor the Social Democrats over, agrarian socialism, but was there any recognition of in his work of that movement in Bulgaria, or was he sort of oblivious to it?
Okay. He wasn't very. He was aware of. Let's call it some kind of agrarian progressive movement to be honest, I don't know the name of it in Bulgaria on the eve of and during the Balkan Wars. But to be honest, he was rather dismissive of it, as you might expect. And he was dismissive of it in the same way as he was dismissive of the Narodniks in Narodniks in Russia, who were essentially, one might call them agrarian socialists, and they basically had, as far as he was concerned, no future. And he didn't give any credence really because he didn't give any credence to peasants as a driving force of the revolution. They could be allies or whatever, but his eyes were always, as they were for most of his co-thinkers of that era, in Marxist terms, on an industrial working class. That's what he was looking for. But of course, he recognized the fact that they were minuscule, that such classes were minuscule. But the peasantry, such peasant socialism, for want of a better term, he did not have a lot of faith in it.
Okay, thank you. We're a bit over time, but we probably have time for one more question if someone would like to ask one. Umit?
Yeah. My question is for Andrekos. Thank you so much for a very well detailed presentation. I was wondering about your standpoint regarding the 1974 Turkish invasion, occupation of Cyprus, as also ethnic cleansing or inter-ethnic strife, or it started with like inter-ethnic strife or turns into an ethnic cleansing. What do you think about this issue, actually?
I think both things are happening simultaneously. Well, I think the ethnic strife begins first, because in some instances, EOKA B has basically gone to some Turkish Cypriot villages, and the example is Maratha Aloa and Sandallar, and removed the men. They've taken them to camps, and then they have gone back to these villages. So this is after the coup, and then we have the invasion. The first phase of the invasion, which does not impact this area, is just between Nicosia and Kyrenia. And basically they go back and they rape the girls and the women. And then when the second phase of the invasion is about to begin, they then go back to these villages and they wipe everybody out. Well, there are one or two people who have hidden. A boy has hidden, for example, and he has survived. But basically, they've gone back and tried to cover it all up by killing them all. So basically, EOKA B manages to do this in a couple of areas. And then, yeah, the ethnic cleansing is basically driven by the Turkish armed forces. Yeah, and incidentally, the men of those villages, they survived. So it's, yeah. Hope I've answered your question.
Yeah. How many villages are we talking about, by the way?
That happened in a similar way. Maybe I think I had it in the list, but there are maybe half a dozen examples. That example being the biggest one. There's a similar thing happening in Dohni. There's in another place, Alaminos, it's more like clashes before. There's more sort of resistance there, but a similar thing also happens there. So there are, 3 or 4 or 5 examples.
Okay, so please join me in thanking the paper givers for the very interesting presentations. I'm going to stop the recording now.